I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, Naturopathic Doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I am pretty excited, although I feel like I open, honestly, every podcast episode by saying I'm excited to talk about this topic. We are talking about dieting in women. We're talking about what we call energy availability and the impact that nutritional advice has on your cycle. We're talking about what our guest is going to explain as lazy advice for female athletes around how to recover from training and from injuries. I feel like this is going to be such a good episode. So tune in, even if you're not what you would call yourself as an athlete. We call all of our females who are participating in sport or who are trying to achieve physical goals. You're all athletes in my mind, and I know you are also athletes in the mind of my guest. I'm joined today by my colleague and friend, Dr. Briana Botsford. And Briana is a naturopathic doctor in Edmonton, Alberta, which, funny story, it wasn't really until COVID that I started to be able to connect with, some badass, amazing female practitioners outside of Ontario. So when you have conferences and when you have things where colleagues kind of all get together and talk to each other, I really didn't have this opportunity to connect well with practitioners who are out of province. And it wasn't until we went through the COVID pandemic that I actually started to connect with women outside of Ontario equally as much as women inside of Ontario. However, we just have this horrifying time change math that we have to do when we hop on calls together all the time. So Briana, thank you so much for taking some time away, not just from your insanely busy practice, but also your brand new baby for us to have this conversation today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm pumped to chat with you.
So we always open with kind of the same question and said, usually when I'm working with practitioners or talking to women who have a particular passion, they have a great story for how they got there. I would love if you could walk our audience through, how did you get to this place where this is what you focus on, where this is what you are so knowledgeable about? How did you get here?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's kind of a funny story. I was an athlete my whole life. I was an aesthetic sport athlete in specifically synchronized swimming. So I specify aesthetic sport because I think we have to differentiate sometimes when it comes to some of the conversations that you and I will be having about energy availability and body composition and things like that. Coming from an aesthetic sport background, I did deal with restrictive eating behaviors and things like that, which I think is fairly common across the board, not just for aesthetic sport athletes. But after I wrapped up with synchro and I graduated from my undergrad, I started racing in Ironman distance triathlons because I was like, well, I can swim, I can probably ride a bike and learn how to run. So why not do the full
The swimming's the hard one.
Yeah, that's what everybody says. I'm like, I got this. So I did that. And when I was training for Ironman, I actually had major problems with painful, heavy periods. And I ended up seeing a naturopathic doctor in Banff where I was living at the time to help me with that. And decided that I wanted to go back to school to become a naturopathic doctor after my first Ironman. I kind of knew about naturopathic medicine because I did a project in grade 4. And I knew I wanted to be a naturopathic doctor since I was in grade 4. I just I wasn't ready to go back to school right away after undergrad. So I took some time and I worked as a personal trainer and, did my Ironman and still stayed really active in athletics. And when I went back to CCNM in Toronto, there was a sports medicine program there that I could sort of do a shift in clinic to learn more about sports medicine. What was funny is one of my supervisors told me, not the sports med supervisor, but another one said, you shouldn't focus on athletes because athletes are healthy and they don't need our help. And I remember thinking, like, okay, that's nice advice, but I'm going to do it anyway. And moving to Edmonton, where there wasn't really anybody having those conversations with athletes about their health. And I figured I would start focusing on prevention. And, you want to stay healthy, you want to be at your peak performance. But then I discovered that athletes have health problems too, shockingly. They're not healthy all the time. And so people would come to me and choose me as their naturopathic doctor because they felt I would understand where they were coming from, or they felt I would have empathy in a different way than another healthcare provider or a different naturopathic doctor because of my background in athletics. And I don't think you have to be an athlete to understand athletes, but I sure think it helps. And knowing what it's like to push your body and to just sort of go along with maybe symptoms that you think, well, everybody deals with pain or everybody deals with IBS symptoms or whatever it might be. But no, they don't. And you don't have to push through it just because you're really good at pushing through other things, like your sport, for example. So that's kind of how I got into more of a, not just prevention with athletes. And then women's health kind of found me. It just happened that the practice I started working in, I was the only female naturopath. And so I started seeing a lot of women's health, and I started doing all my continuing ed in the fertility and perimenopause space. And that's how I came across you. And that's sort of where I landed. And I love it. I love empowering women to feel better. You don't have to feel like a bag of garbage. It can be different.
That's the title of the episode. You don't have to feel like a garbage. So there's so much in there that I want to kind of circle back to. First of all, I love how you like casually reference your Ironman, right? You're like, and then I did Ironman, and then I like, which is amazing. And I think that's like, right, when we know, especially like kind of talking like athlete to athlete, like, the kind of like training and dedication that it takes for someone to be able to endure and persevere and accomplish something like that. That I think that just speaks volume to work ethic. So I always am quite excited when I get to work with practitioners or professionals who I know are athletes, because there's just that sort of like different mindset around the way they approach their work. It's not that dissimilar to the way they approach their sport, which I always appreciate. But I love some of those things that you say there. And like, so for our audience, because I know you and I can tie it together quite easily, like there's a big connection between female hormones and sport, right? Which they may seem like these kind of divergent things. You're either an athlete or have female health issues. But we know that like there is a deep connection between the two of them, and they often will influence each other for better or for worse. Can you just walk us through that a little bit, or give us the Coles Notes sort of biology lesson on how that's all connected?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we have how do we start? We have energy intake and energy expenditure, right? Like we have what we're taking in from our nutrition, and we have what we're putting out in our activity. And so for some women, like as they start to become more active, or, let's say, you decide you want to become a runner and you do your couch to 5K program, and then you're like, hey, half marathon, Ironman, right? Or whatever. But you decide you're going to go through that progression. And as you progress in your sport, or you increase your expenditure, you increase your training, you're not necessarily adjusting your nutrition. If you're not adjusting your nutrition to meet the needs of the demand, then you can have dysfunction in your hormones, specifically with the regularity of the menstrual cycle, ovulating or not ovulating, and that can be like the root cause of the issue. It's not this like fancy, crazy, amorphous idea of like, oh, my hormones need to be balanced or fixed. It's like, we need to fix the nutrition first. And that will help support your training and potentially your menstrual cycle. Of course, there's always going to be medical things that we have to rule out when we're looking at a lack of a menstrual cycle or an irregularity of a menstrual cycle. But if we have the history of sport, being when everything first changed or something along those lines, then we know we need to deal with that. And I think it's interesting because, we used to refer to amenorrhea or lack of a period as, the female athlete triad, right? Stress fractures, no period, and disordered eating. And then they changed the name, I think 2 years ago, to relative energy deficit in sport. And I love that name so much more. The reason they changed the name is because we know that this can occur in men. There can be endocrine dysfunction or hormone dysfunction in men as well as women. But it just is so much more definitive than female athletes sometimes have disordered eating and might lose their period. Oh yeah, and they might break a bone, right? It's a relative energy deficit. You haven't taken in enough energy to meet the demand of what you're putting out. And I think the other piece is that sometimes we have athletes that have an endocrine condition or hormone issue like polycystic ovarian syndrome, where, their Instagram research has led them to believe they need to exercise like crazy in order to get rid of or treat this condition. And now we've created other problems. Or we have an athlete who has an athlete background and has been training their whole life since they had puberty and since they first had a menstrual cycle, and they've actually trained themselves out of that polycystic ovarian syndrome. And now it's harder for us to diagnose when they're trying to start a family or something along those lines. So it's kind of that physiology goes from all different ways, right?
Yeah, I love that sort of reworked definition as well, because I think it's so much easier for people to identify with than, anytime we're using the words kind of like disordered eating as part of a definition. I think it's easy for women and people to say, well, that's not me. I don't
Mm-hmm.
have that.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't identify but when we start to say okay, is there an available fuel for what you're trying to do with your body? Right? Whether or not there's the psychological component to it or not, it's it's pointing out that it is mostly just about fueling and about that. I love that term, energy availability. That I think that's one that people can actually understand. That is there available fuel to do the thing you're trying to do with your body? And if not, we've got a lot of compensation mechanisms and protection mechanisms in the female body that will say, look, if you don't want to eat enough food to support your training, you actually also can't get pregnant at the same time. Right. And so really so much of that hormone dysfunction is a safety switch that's being thrown to
Mm-hmm.
prevent people from falling pregnant when energy availability is low.
Yeah, when the resources aren't there to support a pregnancy, we're just going to turn that function off, right? We're going to say, no, we're not letting this happen. We're not going to do it.
It's not a good time.
Yeah.
And I think the other piece that I always find so fascinating about this is just how, frequently your brain and your hormones are actually checking in on that situation, right? That whole sort of female pathway as far as deciding whether or not to ovulate. It's not like your body checks in once a month to say, is this a good month for me to ovulate? It's actually checking in hourly, every couple of hours. And when we can start to frame that for our female athletes or women who are training, we can go literally your brain is checking in every 2 hours to see if you're well fueled or if we have enough energy to ovulate this month. It's a good sort of reflection moment on what your fueling has looked like in the last month and whether or not that's supportive of ovulation or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not just the snapshot in time of your ovulation day or days around ovulation. It's the net of what you're doing. It's the whole month, couple of months, and then also, like you said, it's every hour. And that's where people will run into issues with they'll say, well, fatigue wise, my energy is good, so I probably don't have, I'm not deficient in calories. But you still could be deficient in calories. I mean, I find most of my patients who are deficient in calories are pretty fatigued. But there are some that'll say, well, no, I think I'm eating enough. And then when we get down into, actually looking at what they're telling me that they're eating every day, it's okay, well, maybe it's not. And then are they timing it? We want net calories to be enough, but then also are they getting enough around their training? Are they getting enough? If you're running a long run on the weekend, are you actually prioritizing more protein in general, but also around your training?
Yeah. And I feel like that's such an eye-opening conversation. So Tom, I got a couple of questions for you. So what are your thoughts on fasting? Let's start there.
Well, I always ask my patients, I'll say, so when do you finish eating at night? And if they say like, 8 or 9 or whatever. And usually there's like, oh, but I know I shouldn't eat after 7 p.m. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's interesting. And sometimes I'll ask why. But they'll say I finish eating 8 or 9 p.m. And okay, well, when do you start eating in the morning? Yeah, like 8 or 9 a.m. Okay, so you're fasting for 12 hours. Yeah, okay, I guess I am fasting for 12 hours. Like, yeah, okay. I don't know. I'm not convinced of the benefit of fasting beyond like stopping eating at night and starting eating in the morning. Like, I mean, being postpartum, I've had some snacks in the middle of the night a few times trying to keep myself up for nursing, or I'm just like hungry at 4 a.m., which is a new fun thing for me. But, I think I don't think there's a lot of value for female athletes. And I don't know about, I would argue probably for women's health in general in fasting, beyond like finishing eating at a certain time and starting again the next day. And the reason for that is that I see more dysfunction in people who are doing days of water fasting, or they're doing like, one meal a day, or these other kind of nuanced versions of intermittent fasting. You fast if you stop eating at night and start again in the morning. That's a fast to me.
I think that's great perspective. And I would kind of agree with you. I think the question I always put back to my patients, I'm like, is this solution creating some problems? Right? Like if you can convince me that this like solution that you've made up or read about on some Instagram post is not creating a problem, then then it's kind of neither here nor there. But
Yeah.
when you squish all of your fueling into a small window of the day, are you meeting all of your needs? Are you hitting all of your protein needs? Which I always find the one meal a day people, I'm like, how's the
How?
120 grams of protein in that one meal going for you? Right? Like, I just physically don't even understand how that happens.
Right.
And once we start to break it down that way, right? That like, how are you eating around your exercise? How are you getting all the things that you need? Are you getting all the calories that you need? Is it actually having a negative impact on your energy, not just energy availability, but like your actual like, perceived energy and fatigue through the day? Usually by the time we get through those like 4 bullet points, right?
Mm-hmm.
My patients are like, this doesn't sound like such a great solution.
Yeah, and like you said, if the solution, if fasting as a potential solution is causing a problem, then it's not the right solution, right? It's it it's not necessary. It's not necessary to continue with something that is causing. It's the same with saying like, well, I'm going to exercise myself into amenorrhea. Like exercise is good for you, but not if it's causing you to not have a period, right? And yeah.
So we kind of opened the episode, or when you and I were off mic and sort of chatting casually, you mentioned this concept of like lazy advice to
Mm-hmm.
your athletes. And I would love if you could kind of dive in on that a little bit, because I really liked kind of the way that you put it around, asking people to stop exercising as a solution to their problems is not a solution. So can you walk us through what you meant by that? What's the lazy advice?
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's when someone comes into my office and they're generally dissatisfied with the advice they've been given, and rightfully so. But I want everyone to know that they're allowed to be dissatisfied with that advice. Like, if you go to a healthcare provider, and it doesn't matter if it's like, it's for your knee or it's for your period. If you're simply given the advice, like, just stop doing CrossFit or just stop running marathons and you're going to get better, that's lazy. Like that's us as a healthcare provider not giving you an actionable solution, because as an athlete, as someone who exercises intentionally, you're not going to do that. I know you're not going to do that. And so for me to sit here and say, well, just stop running and you'll probably get pregnant, it's the same as like, it's the worst, right? Like, so you hear people come into your office and they're like, yeah, like my family just says if I relax, I'll probably get pregnant. You're like, oh yeah. And like the fairy dust will work too. Like, I don't know. It's irritating. And I feel like and it's lazy because we're not actually giving them anything actionable to do, right? Like, athletes want something that they can action. They want something that they can do to get well. And like you said, when we talk about athletes in their work ethic is there. If you give them the steps, they will do it. So we have to give them the right steps to get better, whether it's their knee, and they need to do their rehab exercises. That's not my job, right? But if it's their period and they need to eat differently, or what have you, like, we need to give them the steps. And I feel confident that if we do our job in giving them the steps in a way that they can take in an action, they'll do it. So
I want to walk through what some of those steps are that some of
mhm.
our listeners can kind of think about. But first, I have like a little bit of a side story. It's funny, when I first started working with athletes, I actually didn't love it. And part of it was that I felt like it was pretty, like, I use the word like almost like egocentric, right? That like it's so like focused on like performance or aesthetics or both, or and it was so like precise, right? The 1% improvement, it really mattered to them.
Mhm.
And I at first was like honestly a little bit turned off by that, even though I came from like an athletic background. I still found that part to be like they were so detailed that it was almost like to the point of being frustrating. And then partway through my career, and like or somewhere in the last 10 years, I actually realized that I wish all of my patients actually acted like that when they thought about their health, right? I
Mhm.
wish that people didn't tolerate their symptoms or the things slowing them down. Because
Mhm.
if performance was your job, you just wouldn't tolerate your IBS,
Mhm.
right? Because it would get in the way. It'd be
Yeah.
in the way. And so you'd be like, I have to treat this because it's getting in the way of my
Mhm.
performance. And so many people don't think about their symptoms like that. They don't think about their way their body is performing during the day. They just tolerate it. And now I love talking about that 1%, right? Like how can we like make this even better for you? Those conversations are so wonderful. It's now I find the opposite difficult where I'm the one trying to convince people that it's important that they do
Mhm.
something.
Yeah. Yeah, and exactly that with training too, right? Like we spend so much energy. I'm really looking forward to like 10 or 15 years from now where we don't spend so much energy trying to convince women to like strength train, for example, you know? Like I think I really believe that in the next 10 or 15 years it'll be like we won't have to spend our energy being like you need to go pick up something heavy for your bone mineral density, your muscle mass, like all these benefits, because it'll just be what everybody does. I really hope that that happens. I believe it's going to happen. And it is easier to work with easier. Yeah, I guess it is easier to work with people who are like, okay, yes, that change is going to get me 1%. I'm going to do it. And you know they're going to do it, and you don't have to you don't have to use your energy to motivate them. It sounds like I'm being lazy when I say that, but I mean it's true.
Yeah, it's just an exciting partnership, right? When
Yeah.
people are that sort of jacked about their health. And I think that we can have that sort of athlete mentality for all women who are pursuing better than what they
Mhm.
have, right? Is showing up with the work ethic, not tolerating, levels of dysfunction in their health that are kind of getting in the way of their performance, and thinking about their day like performance. Because when we start to frame it that way, and I want to move into talking about solutions for this energy
Mhm.
availability thing, we talk about your performance during your day, whether it's athletic or not. That's such a different and more positive way of thinking about how you get to show up in the world,
Yeah.
right? Like we need the contribution of women. We are not
Yeah.
going to do that if you're eating 1100 calories. Like you are not going to contribute the way that we need you to contribute.
Yeah.
And so I like thinking about female physiology as like this performance piece that we need women to feel optimal so that they can just show up, whether they're Serena Williams or the next prime minister. Like, let's just show up better.
Yeah. Yeah, I loved you said in one of your episodes I was listening to the other day, you were saying like you wouldn't let Serena Williams go to work without having breakfast. So why do you go? Right? Like it's exactly that. I and we have so much when you talk about solutions, we have so many women who are afraid of specific nutrients, right? They're afraid of carbohydrates. They're afraid of previously, like when I first started practice, people were afraid of fats. right? Now they're afraid of carbs. And it's like, why are we afraid? Yeah, I know. I really hope no one ever gets afraid of protein, because I feel like my job will be very difficult. But like, if they were, when you're afraid of a certain nutrient, or you're limiting a certain nutrient, like, it's really hard to optimize your well-being, and you don't necessarily need to be afraid of it. Like, you need to make sure you're getting enough. I love sitting across the table from patients and saying, like, I actually think you need to eat more carbs. And they're like, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're
I
like,
can,
this is the best prescription I've ever got. Right.
yeah. They're like, start the car. Take the advice and run away. Yeah, they're up for it, which is lovely. But that's something I see all the time.
So as far as talking through solutions, I think like a good piece to walk through is to have, what are some tips that like a listener can think about as far as like reflecting on their own situation that might be signs that, we're going to go back to that term, energy availability is not, there's a mismatch there. So what are some things that our listeners can sort of reflect on in their own life and in their own nutrition that might give them a little bit of a flag that there's something that's not perfect going on with energy availability?
Yeah, I would say the first sign, like, guidepost for me, would be their actual energy level, like their fatigue. Are they fatigued? And is it, when patients come in and their intake form says they want to work on fatigue, one of the first questions I'll ask is like, when are you most tired? Like, is there a time of day when you're most tired? Because that gives me some hints about when that energy deficit may be the worst in terms of the timing of their day. Obviously, we can ask, when are your meals? So first thing is like fatigue, energy level. And then the second thing, assuming you had previously regular menstrual cycles, you're not kind of around the time of perimenopause, which can start early, right? Late 30s, mid 30s even. Um, and like, we're looking, can we explain changes in the cycle in another way, or is this happening from an energy deficit? So have you recently increased your training, or has there been some other change? And maybe our fueling hasn't necessarily adapted to meet that change in our activity level yet. So are you fatigued? Has there been a change in your menstrual cycle? And then also looking at like micronutrient deficiency. So like, are you having hair loss? Like, a lot of, actually, that's like a really common one that people come in for. They're female athletes and they're like, oh, my hair is falling out. Okay, something might be not quite right here with your energy availability, and could specifically be iron deficiency, but it also could be like macronutrient deficiencies causing that micronutrient deficiency of iron or B12 or something along those lines, right? So physical symptoms, whether it's hair loss, whether it's something else along those lines, like, I think athletes also are really intuitive. Like, they'll give the example of, when I was pregnant, I knew I was pregnant because my resting heart rate was 60 beats per minute instead of 54. So, like, you're like, okay, small difference, but
So
like,
precise.
something, yeah, something is up here. But I mean, that's not true for everyone, but that was true for me. So like, if something feels off, or you're constantly, the other thing is injuries. We'll see women constantly getting injured or sick. Now, right now it's different because people aren't getting colds and flus as much, but recurring colds and flus was a big thing previously, where you're not getting enough protein. So then when we look at fixing each one of those things, like, the first thing I would say is protein. We look at total protein intake. And oftentimes the first thing I will do is look at breakfast, because I always joke, like, breakfast doesn't have to be dessert. Like, yes, you can have sweet sources of protein. I'm a big fan of protein powders, Greek yogurt. Like, you can have sweeter sources of protein, that's fine. But like, eggs, chicken, chicken and fish are common breakfast proteins in a lot of cultures. We just commonly eat sweet breakfasts, and that may not be the best thing for our energy availability, specifically when it comes to protein. Also, with breakfast, lots of people will say, well, I prefer to train fasted first thing in the morning. Now, fasted workouts aren't the end of the world if it works for you. Like, if you can perform, if you prefer to do your intervals, because you got to get up at 5 to do it, and you just can't stomach anything other than your coffee, like, first thing in the morning, okay, fine. But are you actually hitting those intervals? Are you fueled enough do you have enough storage on board to do those intervals? Or do we need to consider some kind of fuel source with your coffee, some kind of carbohydrate in the morning? Maybe like my favorite thing to recommend is a banana, but some people hate them. So, it doesn't work for everybody, but like, what do we need to do there to help with a morning workout? Or is your morning workout fine? Because if it's fine, if it's not broken, we don't have to fix it, right? And then once we build off of like, what are you doing for breakfast first thing in the morning? It's like, are you getting enough at lunch and at supper? And then if not, do we need to build in snacks? And how do we do that? Lots of people work out or do their training like after supper, like in the evenings, right? And so we have to figure out how to time our fueling around that too, so we can get extra protein if we need it in after that workout, or just throughout the day. So we'll look at like total nutrient intake, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, and then we'll look at timing. I would say total intake is more important than timing, right? And it doesn't have to be perfect. I always say this, like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. When we're looking at protein sources, if you're having pepperoni sticks for a snack, that doesn't bug me. Like, yes, there is sodium. Yes, they are preserved. I'm not mad about it. Like, it's okay. We have to sometimes choose these convenience foods, in the name of getting what we need to fuel ourselves. You're not going to be able to make protein muffins and protein balls and little egg bites. And like, you're not going to be able to do that 100% of the time. So sometimes you're going to need to shop for those convenience foods, and that's okay.
It's more than okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when I recommend the turkey slices to people, they're like gasp, like, are you sure? Like
the nitrates. Oh my God.
Are there special ones that I don't know about? Right. That like, this is what my patient is thinking, that there must be like these extra special, super clean, organic, blessed turkey slices that I'm like, no, just get some turkey slices and eat those. It's fine. So you mentioned a couple of great things there. So just to recap, so symptoms wise, we're looking at, like, first of all, like, I think if we're training and I would say if we're quasi dieting, or we're going to throw that term in there, if you have symptoms, we probably need to make sure that it's not from that.
Yes. 100%.
Right? Whether it's your hair loss or I'm going to go night sweats and up at night and poor sleep quality and can't get out of bed in the morning and afternoon crashing and all of those things. Like, we have to take a pretty hard look at your exercise and fueling if you have not any symptom, but lots of symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would always look at that. Like that's my bias though. Yeah. Yeah. But that's the foundation, right? Yeah. Like, you can use like supplements and herbs and medications and like all these things, but like, if the foundation isn't there, then they're only going to help so much, if at all.
Yeah, exactly. And so all symptoms, because we're biased, need to be thought of in the context of energy availability and training volume and all of the things. And again, like, if you're listening to this and you're like, they're not talking about me, they're using words like training volume and all exercise goes in that training column, if you ask me. And I know you feel the same way about it. And I think this is where we miss this opportunity for so many women to be fueled well enough for performance and their exercise, because we treat the weekend warrior as being a different breed than the way we treat athletes.
Yeah. Like, if you've started going to CrossFit 3 times a week, you're an athlete. Like, we need to talk about your fueling. We need to be like, you're always going to need to examine. I won't say change, because I don't think there's always a need to change your nutrition. But in most people, if we change the activity level, we need to change our nutrition. And we know that this happens naturally. Most people, when they start to move their body more, they're more hungry and they eat more, right? But what happens for a lot of, I will say female athletes, but I'm sure this is in the context of all humans, is that some of us have been brainwashed to think that smaller is better, whether that is for performance. I can't tell you how many runners come in and they're afraid to gain weight because they think it's going to slow them down, right? And that could be muscle. Like, it doesn't matter what the weight is. They're just afraid to be bigger in any way, heavier in any way, because it's going to slow them down. But reality is most people are wired to eat more when they expend more energy, but we're in this mindset of control and decrease and become smaller into what, like dust? I don't know. But I think, well, I don't know. That's how I feel sometimes. I'm like, why do we need to be smaller all the time? And that's a whole other conversation. We've been brainwashed to think. I grew up in the Kate Moss era, right? Like tiny stick thin models were the goal body type. And I think that's sort of changing, and it's interesting to look at that now. But people still think that they need to eat less, even when they're exercising more. And that's when we run into challenges. And the joke I make is, you don't get a gold medal for eating as little as possible all day, right? You don't, I'm sure that's not how our world champions think or fuel. So we have to eat throughout the day to fuel our bodies and our brains. Otherwise, we get home and we get to the cupboard and it's like, let's eat everything. We're gonna eat everything. So
yeah. And that's such a good reminder that like any change in exercise just requires, and like you said, it's not everything that needs to be changed all the time, but more just like this reflective, casual, like consideration of whether or not your food is meeting the needs of your exercise. And if you're not sure, that's when we need to be having a conversation with someone who does know. I think there's so much DIY nutrition out there, and DIY nutrition, especially like in the world of athletes, that we do run into these problems around fueling, and as it's like being able to support or not support someone's performance. It's interesting. I had a patient not too long ago who was talking about her exercise so casually, right? And she was like, yeah, it's just my walk. Kind of like the way you say it's just my Ironman.
Yeah.
And we couldn't like fatigue. We just could not figure out this whole fatigue thing. And it wasn't until I was like asking about like the actual whole day. And it was like, well, then at like 6 o'clock I go for my walk, and then at 8 o'clock I get home. And I was like, whoa, what? Like go back to the walk part. Like what happens during the walk? And her walks were 15, 17K.
Yeah.
They're not just walks, right? And I think that's so easy. We like gloss over some exercises in general, like walking. We gloss over exercises that are part of our routine. So people will say, I've swam laps forever. So they cannot be the problem.
Yeah.
Right. But it's like, well, you've never fueled well. And so your laps are a problem, actually, even though you've been doing them every day for 10 years, they're actually a problem. So people's routines are a problem, but they don't know because they're routine.
And we would never tell someone not to walk, right? We would never say, oh, just stop walking and like it'll all resolve. So why do we tell the person who's running, like stop running, or the person lap swimming or crossfitting or like Orange Theorying or whatever? Like we never tell those people that are doing walks or something that we consider gentle that sounds like a lot of walking. That doesn't sound gentle to me, right? But like, we would never tell her like, oh, just stop walking and you'll be all better.
So big theme here is like, you need to look a little bit more critically at like your symptoms. And if you're exercising and trying things with your diet, or maybe your diet is never been a consideration as part of your performance, then that's a really good spot to start looking. And then on the converse to that, or like alongside of that, from a solutions perspective, looking at like the timing of food through the day, the amount of food through the day, making sure that we're hitting those protein needs specifically and not having fear around some of those other macronutrients. Is there anything else you would add to that list?
Yeah, in the context of solutions. Yeah, I think like that's a really good place to start. And then like on top of like the foods that you're eating, then we might be looking at adding in things like a protein supplement or a fatty, like, do you know what I mean? Then we might be looking at adding in those things as a solution. But we always want to start with what are you actually eating and where are you getting it in your food? And then go from there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that approach, Briana, because it's like, and I'm sure you experience this well, that sometimes when we meet people who have started exercising, or maybe they're like knee deep into their new exercise addiction, and they're like, oh, I'm using gels during my run or and I'm like, well, what about the breakfast part? Like, where's the actual food? And I do think that it's common for people to kind of like jump over basic solutions to the kind of sexier, maybe even sports specific kind of solutions without thinking about like the grassroots energy availability from like their actual diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. What are you actually putting in the tank? And then, yeah, is that working?
I think this is such a great and sort of important conversation. One other thing that I'm curious about your thoughts are is the impact of all of this on mood.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that's like mental health has always been such a passion of mine. And I feel like there are so many people who are using exercise as medicine in a sense, right? Now we can argue that, yeah, you should probably also go to therapy, but we can't say that exercise isn't beneficial for mood. So we'll run into that too, where we have people who are training or who have, I won't say an addiction, but an attachment to their training as a means of helping their mental health. And then we still have to look at nutrient wise, are you still meeting your what your training is demanding to support your mental health? Because even when I do an entire lecture almost every year for a teachers convention at Edmonton about mood and food, and ultimately it comes down to energy availability in terms of the regularity of your intake, right? Like if you are um skipping breakfast and you're having your coffee and that's you basically going on fumes until noon, then how are you going to feel in the morning? Are you going to feel energized and vibrant and enthusiastic? Probably not. Like some people are like, no, I feel fine. That's totally fine. Okay, great. Good for you. But if you don't feel fine, maybe you should have a snack, right? Or like an egg, not just an egg, but maybe a few, you know. Um, it's that timing of your energy intake can influence your mood. If you're always crashing at 3 o'clock, what's going on there? What did we have for lunch? Is it time for a snack? Right. And how do we get that in to support because I think energy and mood are really linked, right? We know depression can be really linked to like fatigue, right? And sometimes it's hard to tease out, is this fatigue or is this depression? Are you sad because you're tired, or are you tired because you're sad? Right? It's a chicken and egg scenario. Same thing with anxiety. Like when your brain doesn't have enough fuel, how does it feel? Anxious, right? It's scared. It's like, oh
It's
my God, I don't
worried.
have enough. Yeah, it's worried. And so are you. So like it's not, and that's I'm making light of it, but ultimately, like if you are, I notice it myself all the time. Like if I, especially right now, if I have forgotten to eat, which I don't know how that happens, but it does now that I have a baby. And then I'm like, oh my God, I'm like vibrating. I'm like the laundry and the baby and then the podcast with Jordan and the thing. And like, did I eat? I didn't eat. I gotta eat. Right. And I can intuit that, but not everybody is there yet. And I think eventually if you can know yourself, ultimately it'd be better if you could just like remember to eat at regular intervals, right? It's not rocket science, but it will help you. So I think like when it comes to mental health, there's the macronutrients and the effect on your blood sugar. When your blood sugar gets low, your brain is freaking out and it's going to ask you for fuel. And that might be coming as making you feel anxious, nervous, sad, tired, any of the above, right? You can reach for the coffee, which is delicious. I know you love coffee. I love coffee, but like you can also have a protein source, fat, fiber, and protein. That's what's going to help keep your energy level stable and help your mood to stay stable. Then we look at the micronutrients, right? Like an iron deficiency can make you feel obviously fatigued, maybe down and depressed, also could be anxious. So we're always going to look at those things when it comes to nutrition and energy availability, food intake. We're always going to, if we have a mental health concern, depression, anxiety, more specifically, we're going to look at nutrition and timing of nutrition um, to make sure that it's supporting your mental health.
These are such good points, Brianna. And I think, I'm hopeful that the listener who's listening, who maybe has jumped to some conclusions about their hormones, right? You kind of opened with the like, we kind of feel victimized by our hormones a little bit. There's certainly a lot of like narrative online about hormones being horrible and bad, and we need to banish them or balance them or detoxify from them or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think I'm going to use the word blame symptoms like fatigue and mood and hair loss and whatnot on our hormones. And in these athletes, or even just people who are, I'm going to use the word, kind of overtraining, under fueling, are going to see hormone changes. So now their periods are a bit heavier than they were, or they're a bit more irregular than they were, combined with their fatigue and all that. It's really easy for us to label that a hormone problem.
Yeah. But where did it start, right? Like you said, it's like that undertraining, overtraining, under fueling. Like that's where it started. So if we can start there, and then if we need to get into the hormone, like maybe the hormones will work themselves out, maybe they won't, and we need to do some things. But like you have to start with those foundations. Same thing with your mental health, and you know when we say we blame our hormones, even in PMS, right? Like I can't think of the citation, but you've talked about this study before where, the carb deprivation and patients who are fed carbs, remarkably,
they're just happier.
Yeah. Less mental and physical
symptoms.
I know, right? Like, and I'm not like, it's not to say like you go and you eat, I don't know, pasta like 5 times a day, every day, and that's your solution to all your health problems. No, that's not what we're trying to say. Like, but we're just classically seeing this carbohydrate restriction, and then, or energy restriction, food restriction, or not even intentional restriction. Just, I forgot, I didn't have enough time, I didn't plan, or have just the thought to go to the deli counter and get the turkey slices. Like those small bits of your support structure, you need to have those built in so that you don't end up in these situations, right? So yeah.
Exactly. I think if our listeners are going to take anything away from today, it's that they can eat some pepperettes and it's fine.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally.
Where can our listeners find you? I know you offer some great resources and solutions for women and athletes on understanding these concepts. Where can we find you? What's your kind of like final message for our audience?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at DocBriBots. And I have my clinic website, which is Flow Functional Healthcare. It's flowweg.ca. And I mean, my take home is, for our athletes, don't accept that lazy advice, right? Dig deeper, demand better, because I know most of you will. And if there are symptoms that are occurring, let's look at the basics first. And then if we need to, we can get fancy.
I love it. It's so practical. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and for taking time away from your baby. We will put all of your links on Instagram. Briana is awesome to follow on Instagram. She's so inspiring in her bike gear.
Thank you.
We will put all the links to that. Briana, I'm so grateful for you and your contributions to our community. I love that there is an entire cohort of women practitioners who are changing that narrative around fueling and female athletics. I just think this is such an important conversation. So I'm grateful for your time today. Thanks for hanging out with me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.